Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we're going to take a look at the 155 shotgun, which I've been using to complete setup and silent caliber. We've checked out the 153 in the past using the meta setup with a modded stock and pistol grip, but since then the 155 has come onto the scene, so firstly let's check it out and we'll compare the two a bit later on. To start with, the 155 can be bought from Jaeger 2 at 35,000 rubles, and unfortunately there are no barters for this weapon, so other than just trying to snipe a 100% version from the fleet, we just have to kinda go with it. You can use a busted one, but if you do, you run the risk of malfunctions, which is why I usually advise to get a max durability version if you intend to mod it in any way. You might be surprised how cheap the parts are relatively to make the Ultima version of the 155, and we're going to do this first to make the minimum recoil weapon with 129 vertical and 65 ergonomics. So we're going to start with Jaeger's base weapon and edit the presets like we usually do. There's normally only one part for the Ultima that you can replace, so which makes it quite easy to do the modding. So we start with the 155 walnut forestock and replace this with the Ultima polymer forestock like so. Then next we're going to look at the stock, which can be replaced with the Ultima pistol grip, and then onto the pistol grip you have a couple of choices. First one, you can just blank it off so that it's a very short version, which I wouldn't really recommend because the vertical recoil is kind of off the scale. Otherwise you want to use the Ultima polymer stock, and on the back of that there are three different butt pads to choose from. There's a thin one, a medium one and a large one. The large pad gives us the most recoil reduction and the thin version gives us the most ergonomics. So normally I'm just going to pick the large version. Just bear in mind that the large and the medium versions are both found on Jaeger level 3, whereas the Ultima thin version is found on Jaeger 2. So if you're struggling with Jaeger, you might need to plump for the thin one, but we're going to use the large one for the time being. Next, we're going to look at the top rail, and on this one, we have to use the MP155 Ultimate top rail, and this gives us all of the different Picatinny rails to enable us to add sights and other optics and tactical devices and that kind of thing. This gives us some recoil reduction as well as some ergonomics, but unfortunately this one is Jaeger 3 only. Next, there's another part which is over on this side, which is the Ultima underbarrel mount, which we add on and get 5 more ergonomics like so. And then my usual favourite from the magazines is to replace the 6-rounder with the MP133 8-rounder. You actually get 1 ergonomics for replacing this and get 2 more shells in there, so we may as well. And this only comes from Jaeger 2 as well, so it's fairly easy to upgrade to. If you really want to squeak out every piece of ergonomics that you can add the Chris Defiance, because these are the lowest weight front sight, and also the same thing on the rear sight. We just find that one here. You can see it's only 0.02 of a kilogram, which is very, very light and gives us 1 ergonomics per each sight. Now, finally, to get our recoil down really, really low, the best in slot version that you can get on the front here is using the ME cylinder from Jaeger 1, and on top of that, you then have the Monster Claw from Mechanic 4, and you can see just how much recoil reduction there is using this particular attachment on this shotgun, which takes us down to 129 vertical recoil and 65 ergonomics. We haven't added a laser or a flashlight or anything like that, or an optic yet, but if you go with this build, let's go into find parts for the moment and get rid of the base weapon, which we said was going to be 35,000. We don't need the barrel. Roll up a little bit. Everything else we're going to have to buy. So this is 46,000 rubles worth of parts. With the base weapon cost of 35k, this is pretty much 81,000 rubles before optics and lasers, which is not bad for a build that looks kinda cool. If we want to suppress this weapon, there are 2 choices. The first one uses the same ME cylinder, and instead of the Monster Claw, you replace this with the Hexagon 12k, and that's 26,000 rubles from Skier 2. There is a barter for a wooden clock for this, but they're really expensive at the moment, so it's not useful. The other suppressor that people tend to use, you have to change the ME cylinder for the 12 gauge adapter for Silencer Co, and on top of that, you then add the Salvo 12 sound suppressor. This gives us a little bit more recoil reduction than the Hexagon version, and this is normally the one that you find that people use. So if we go onto the flea market and go through this link here, then we can see that they cost about 35,000 rubles. Now, Mechanic does sell them for 40k, and this is Mechanic 4 technically speaking, but because suppressed shotgun builds are not all that common, you tend to find fairly cheap prices on the flea from players. Personally, I am less bothered about the suppressor on a shotgun because normally you're fairly close anyway, and I would rather take the extra ergonomics, but you need one for silent caliber, which is what most people use these builds for originally, and typically the Salvo 12 for that extra recoil reduction. So the sticking point to this build is really the top rail, which is a bit of a problem because it's Jaeger 3 and it's quite expensive on the flea market. But also the Monster Claw if you're going for the minimum recoil version, because that one is Mechanic 4 and can be quite hard to get because that's also expensive on the flea market. Instead of the Monster Claw for an unsuppressed build, you can just swap this over onto GK02, which is very cheap from Jaeger 2 because it's only 4,000 rubles and it also fits onto the ME cylinder. And yes, you don't get quite the same level of recoil, but this may not matter as we'll check out in a moment. As for this top rail, unless you want to shell out on the fleet, there's not really much you can do about it, and the big problem is that if you don't include the top rail on here, the other version does not go on with the other parts, so it's kind of all or nothing. You either build the full Ultima once you have Jaeger 3, or you don't build it at all and keep it as stock and just try to use it as best as you can. However, the real question now is, does adding all this extra stuff actually make a big difference to the gun? We ended up before with 129 recoil and 62 ergonomics once we've added a sight and a laser, and comparing this to an equivalent build with 218 recoil and 43 ergo just using the extended mag, the cheap GK02 muzzle, and XPS03, we can test the difference. Regarding ergonomics and ADS speed, we can see a small benefit for the meta version, which is about 3 frames of advantage, equating to around 50 milliseconds of quicker ADS, which is pretty small to be honest, versus some of the other comparisons we've looked at in the past for other guns. I think one of the problems here is that although you get more ergo by adding the Ultima parts, you also add another half kilo onto the weight of the shotgun, which counters the statistical increase in ergonomics a bit. One thing to note here on the recoil test is that I was using AP20 slugs, as this is my favoured round of choice, so if you're using flechette, the recoil that you'll find is actually going to be less than you see here. But despite all that, although the meta version clearly has lower recoil and retains better sight picture because of it, the time that it takes for each weapon to return to centre is very similar, leading to both feeling surprisingly close in performance. Take for example when the reticle for the cheap guy is way off the screen. Well, you still wouldn't want to be taking a shot with the meta version, so does it matter all that much? I honestly think that the cheap version performs with very similar effectiveness. Next, we're going to be looking at how this stands up versus the 153. We're going to be looking at both the cheapo standard versions of both, and then the meta version of the 153 as well, which has the ergo stock, the GL core on it to try to make them as equivalent as possible. With the basic builds, we get to 218 recoil on both weapons using the GK02. One of the reasons why the 155 has so much better ergo than the 153 normally is the barrel length. The standard for the 155 is the 510mm barrel, but on the 153 you get the long 750mm barrel as default. On the 153 though, you can swap out the barrels for different lengths. Here I just changed it over to the 610mm version, which is the shortest possible on the 153. Which is likely why we get to the same ending stats here. This short 153 barrel is a Jaeger 3 purchase, but it's more to demonstrate the point. You can get a very similar weapon by making the 153 short on the same scale as the 155, and given the old barrel sells back to mechanic for 4,000, it only costs 3.5k to make this change. Anyway, all that said, we can see here from the test that the 153 has a slightly faster return to center time than the 155, which makes it slightly more optimal to lay down follow-up shots after the initial one. Finally, the meta versions of these weapons. On ADS speed, the 155 just pips the 153, beating it again by about 3 frames. Do note here that the 155 has a better statistical recoil than the 153, even at full recoil reduction, so moving to the GL core stock takes this a bit worse still versus the 155. But because both are still relatively low for a shotgun, and again they act very similarly when it comes to sight picture and the return to center after a shot, the slightly better 153 centering is offset by the 155's recoil stat. The big difference between these weapons comes with accuracy. Because the default and meta versions of the 153 take the longer barrel, the difference in MOA between those guns is really extreme. With the AP slugs where it matters the most, we're talking 11.84 MOA on the 155 versus 5.73 on the 153. Remember that firstly MOA roughly means 3 cm at 100 meters, and in Tarkov this is represented as the radius of the circle rather than the diameter. So even at 50 meters, an MOA of 12 represents a circle of roughly 6 times 3 centimeters, which is 18 centimeters, or a full width diameter of 36 centimeters. This could easily miss someone's head if you were shooting at that distance. So my overall thoughts are as follows. The 155 is good in CQB when maxed out, as it has the fastest ADS speed and it has better vertical recoil than the 153 in general despite having a shorter barrel. This means that the camera jumps less and gives you an easier time keeping aim on targets at close range. However, the full build comes to around 110k with sights. If you're looking for the best close range between the two and prioritising ADS speed, I'd go for the 155 Ultima. The 153 on the other hand can be tailored to either a CQB build with the shorter barrels, where it is slightly cheaper than the 155 due to the cost of the base weapon but with worse ergonomics, or when used in medium range builds where it's clearly the better option of the two due to MOA when using the longest default barrel. This is the sniper shotgun, so to speak. The slightly faster return to center time gives the user the potential to fire off a greater volume of precision shots in the same time versus the 155, but there is a trade-off here, as if you choose the longer barrel for accuracy, you will have a distinctly lower ergonomics which can become a problem when suppressed or at close range. Otherwise, higher ergo builds suffer from the same MOA issues as the 155 with the shorter barrels. They don't get to as good an ergo level as the 155 and generally tend to have more overall kick upwards, as we can't reach the same levels of vertical recoil for the same ergo, although this is offset a little bit by the 153's return time. For pure budget, the GKO2 build on either weapon is a very close proxy for the meta version and costs nearly an identical amount between the two guns if you swap the 153 to the shorter barrel. However, with the 153's ability to be purchased with the keys barter, sometimes cheaper than the 29k Jaeger list price, and the improvement in return to center time being more obvious when using the budget builds, I think that on the cheap end, the 153 just edges slightly ahead. The final thing I wanted to mention about the 155 is the optional thermal camera that can be attached to the stock on the Ultima version. It's about 20 to 40k on the fleet, as it's only available from a barter with Jaeger for 2 Nixel lenses, which is way more, and it's cheap for a reason. The field of view on the camera display is super low, which limits its usefulness greatly, and is super hard to use to shoot people. The only things I can think of any use for it so far is firstly the fact that you can use it to see through enemy flashlights, and also your own if you're using one of the mega lamp builds with multiple flashlights that makes it hard for even you to see through normally. The other potential is the ability to maybe look around corners just a little bit, although it's very hard to see the screen and actually work out what's happening there. Maybe someone more skilled than me can figure out a way to get this to actually be practical. So as usual, if you learnt something, please consider dropping a like and a comment. To see when I'm streaming, you can follow me on Twitter and Twitch. Check out our ScavTalk podcast in the links below, and with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.